Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Triggernometry, where I'll be talking to Konstantin all about Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin. If you want to ask Konstantin any questions, send us through a super chat and we'll be answering them in the second half of the episode. Welcome, mate.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Just before we get into the main body of the interview, the one thing that I found very interesting was actually the response on social media to the whole interview. It was quite interesting, wasn't it?
Social media and the media.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I think if whoever you're listening to or reading or follow on Twitter, Instagram, whatever, anyone who had an opinion on this before they saw the interview or before the interview was out, you should stop listening to, because these are people who are prepared to have an opinion on things they haven't seen. But we laugh, but it's actually quite a legitimate point, because we live in this world where there's like this really crazy, perverse incentive structure for people to comment on things before they've even been released. And I just think it's so discrediting if you do that. So obviously everyone has their own preconception about Putin, the war, or whatever, and Tucker. And I certainly do on all those things. I've been on his show a couple of times. I very much disagree with the positions he's taken on Russia and Ukraine, etc. But you have to listen to the thing before you comment on the thing. That's kind of basic, isn't it?
It was about 5 years ago, mate. Not anymore, really, sadly.
Well, that's kind of it. So I guess what people, the big debate was, is it good journalism or not? And that's the one thing you really cannot assess until you've watched the interview, because you can dislike Tucker and think he's not a great journalist, but he might have done a great piece of journalism. Or you can really like Tucker and then, he might not have done a great piece. You have to actually see the thing. So the question is, having watched it, number one, was it a good piece of journalism? And I actually don't know the answer to that, because it really depends on what you mean, right? We watched it. It's a 2 hour and 20-minute interview. The first 2 hours plus, he asks a question and lets Putin answer. And that's all that really happens. He tries to interject once or twice. Putin kind of steamrolls over it. I'm sure we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
And then at the end, when he asks about the American journalist who Putin thinks is a spy, then there's a little bit of back and forth, and actually they get into a bit of a more like answer pushback type of situation, which doesn't really go very far. So is that good journalism? Is it good journalism to let Putin talk for 2 hours without interruption? I actually kind of think it is, because one of the things, as you know, I've been doing is translating Putin's speeches, not because I agree with Putin, but I think it's really important for people in the West to hear his point of view, not because it's necessarily a legitimate point of view, but I actually do agree with Tucker that most of it, not all of it, but most of it Putin believes sincerely. So whether he's right or wrong, or whether what he's saying is true or not, you do need to know what your adversaries are thinking, right? So from my perspective, I have no problem with the way Tucker conducted the interview. Would I have liked to see him challenge more? Yes. Would I have liked to see him be better prepared? Yes. Would I have liked the interview to be 5 hours instead of 2 so that could happen? Yes. Are any of those things possible? Well, I don't know, right? So, but certainly the idea that Putin went up there to like big him up didn't come across that way to me. However, obviously, not everybody sat there and watched the full 2 hour and 20-minute interview. Some people just liked, hearing Putin look presidential and, look less demented than Joe Biden and whatever. That seemed to be like the rightoid talking point, look how great he looks, which is a very superficial way to look at it, I think. And the left-wing talking point was, Tucker is just giving him a platform, as if Putin needed a platform. So it was kind of two very stupid sides arguing and making very stupid points, in my opinion.
One thing I think that can't be disputed, actually, and again, there's a human element where I look at Tucker, and it's very easy to go, he should have done it, he should have done that, he should have done this, he should have done that. When the guy is in the Kremlin and opposite one of the most powerful men in the world, Vladimir Putin. In his country, literally in his capital.
Where people do regularly fall out of windows, come down with strange diseases.
Exactly. So, but having said all that, Vladimir Putin was in control right the way through. And he did something very interesting where he was saying, well, is this going to be a chat show? Is this going to be something more serious?
Yeah.
Which I thought was a very interesting ploy. What did you think about that?
Well, I think what he was doing is he was essentially saying to Tucker, like, let me talk and let me lay out my serious points.
Yeah.
This isn't a talk show where you get to interject every 3 seconds and whatever. And you're completely right. He was in control. By the way, a lot of people who may be watching him for the first time or reading a speech of his for the first time are like, oh my God, I can't believe he talked about the history of Russia for 40 minutes, which I'm sure we'll get to. Actually, every speech he does now is like a 3-hour speech, and the first hour is about the history of Russia. He's quite used at this point, having been in power for 25 years now, you know, to being listened to holding court. And this is, you know, people will say this is my anti-Putin bias, but it's just a fact. When you've been in power for 25 years, your power is undisputed and unchallenged. You start to feel like you can, you know, take your time to explain things that people need to hear. And we saw this with Fidel Castro, you know, giving 12-hour speeches.
Yeah.
This is quite normal for people who've been in power for a long time. It just is. And by the way, even in a democratic country, I mean, you know, Thatcher used to go on quite a bit. People would kind of say that. Do you know what I mean? Like, people who are in those positions for a very long time are used to going on at length about their opinions. And so that's kind of what you saw playing out.
Yeah, indeed. So let's get into the history of Russia. What did you actually think about his description of the history of Russia? Was it accurate?
Yeah, it was. So broadly speaking, what he's saying about the history of Russia is entirely correct. And what I found very interesting is how many people were saying that, oh, he was just saying all this irrelevant stuff. And it's only irrelevant if you don't understand the point he's actually trying to make, which is very, very obvious. He spends half an hour basically making the case for the fact that Ukraine is not a legitimate country, it has no right to exist, and most of it is Russian land, populated by Russian people, and it belongs to Russia. Now, what's interesting is Tucker actually does challenge him and says, well, you know, why have you not said that for the first 22 years of your being in power? And Putin never answers, interestingly enough, which is telling. And the point Tucker is making to him is, you never justified your invasion of Ukraine in 2022 in these terms. And yet, as Putin has done in every big speech he has done, he keeps talking about this point, that these are our lands populated by Russian people, Russian speakers, without ever saying the thing that he actually is saying, which is basically, it's my land, I'm entitled to it.
Yeah, and what's interesting as well is that he even talks about the word Ukraine and says like it has no meaning in the sense of a country, which I found very interesting.
Look, the fact is, historically, the points he's making are not incorrect in that Ukraine didn't really exist as a country prior to being formed during the Soviet period. Even during the Soviet period, it was given lands both from the Russian part and from what was Hungary and Romania, and it was kind of made into this artificial country, you might say. Then again, there's quite a lot of artificial countries in the world. This is not unusual. And in any case, even that all being true, that is not the justification for the invasion that he ever gave. If he said, you know, this is Russian territory, we're taking it back, we could then have a debate about whether that's a legitimate casus belli or not, legitimate cause for war or not. But he's kind of saying one thing while claiming a different thing as the cause for this war, which I'm sure we'll get to.
No, absolutely. And before we move on, he said like Lenin inexplicably gave these territories away.
Well, right, sorry to interject, but I'm so incensed about this point, and I have been for the last 2 years, because a lot of people in the West keep saying, there's, you know, right-wing stupid ways of looking at it and left-wing stupid, but one of them is, oh yeah, Putin's a communist and he's trying to rebuild the USSR, which is just so stupid. Like, he keeps basically criticizing Soviet leaders and Russian leaders. He keeps criticizing Lenin, he keeps criticizing Stalin, he keeps criticizing Khrushchev. And what he's basically saying is, it's my duty to undo the mistakes of the past leaders, particularly the Soviet leaders. And so he's not trying to rebuild the Soviet Union at all. What he's trying to rebuild is the Russian Empire. He's trying to recapitulate within the Russian state the Russian lands that are historically Russian, populated by Russian people.
Absolutely. And it was very, very clear when he spoke about it. And if you took the time to actually listen, you'll understand. But there was one point that we both found very interesting, and we've got the clip coming up here, which is him talking about Poland and in 1939.
And before you play it, Elliot, this is actually the entire point of the historical monologue. And this is like the quintessential bit that tells you what he's actually saying. I really recommend people pay attention to this.
So here it is.
In 1939, after Poland cooperated with Hitler, it did collaborate with Hitler, you know? Hitler offered Poland peace and a treaty of friendship, an alliance demanding in return that Poland give back to Germany the so-called Danzig corridor, which connected the bulk of Germany with East Prussia and Königsberg. After World War I, this territory was transferred to Poland, and instead of Danzig, a city of Gdansk emerged. Hitler asked them to give it amicably, but they refused.
Of course.
Still, they collaborated with Hitler and engaged together in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia.
But may I ask you, you're making the case that Ukraine, certainly parts of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, is in effect Russia has been for hundreds of years. Why wouldn't you just take it when you became president 24 years ago? You have nuclear weapons, they don't. If it's actually your land, why did you wait so long?
Sure.
I'll tell you. I'm coming to that. This briefing is coming to an end. It might be boring, but...
So, when we both watched it, I watched it and I went, there's something off about that. And I saw you have quite a visceral reaction. Why was that?
Well, first of all, notice that in the entire interview, he never actually answers this point that Tucker made, which is actually a good interjection from Tucker, number one. But basically, if you listen to what he's saying, first of all, I mean, the history of that period is quite complicated. He talks about how Poland cooperated with the Germans in the Czech thing. A little bit of truth to that. But what's interesting is he doesn't mention that the Soviet Union collaborated with Germany to split Poland in 1939. And the Soviet Union actually got the bigger half of Poland in that process. But there's something even more interesting in this entire thing than that, which he says, Poland was given an opportunity to amicably give back to Germany the land that it rightfully was taken from. And he's basically setting up the argument for his own territorial recapture aspirations, which is, you know, we made lots of peaceful overtures about this being our land, and we were rebuffed. And he's essentially saying Poland started World War II by refusing what it should have done, which is give the land back to Germany.
Yeah.
And this is the core of his historical argument is we are entitled to our former land. And that's why he's presenting Poland as essentially the party that started World War II. When in fact, actually the Soviet Union helped Germany to split Poland between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany under the secret protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which people know about, the Nazi-Soviet alliance, which lasted for 2 years, during which time the Soviet Union provided food, grain, oil, and other supplies to Germany, including diplomatic help as well. So this is the core of his historical argument, essentially. Countries are allowed to retake their land, and if the other country which currently has it refuses to give it, we can come in and take it.
But don't you find it quite interesting because that's clearly not correct. It's historically incorrect. So he's justifying the war and the invasion with a point that's historically incorrect.
I don't know that it is historically incorrect. I mean, look, this is a point I've made. People don't like hearing this, but it is true. Hitler had a stronger case for annexing the Sudetenland, reoccupying Czechoslovakia, the Anschluss, his claims to Polish lands were in these terms, on this basis. I'm not saying I agree with it, but on the basis that a country is entitled to recapture lands that are populated by its former populations, by its ethnic speakers who are being mistreated there. I mean, the Treaty of Versailles took massive German populated lands and gave them to countries that didn't exist on a map at that point. During the period prior to the Treaty of Versailles, Poland didn't exist as it is then or now. The Czechoslovakia didn't exist. These lands were populated to some extent by Germans, in the Sudetenland in particular, who were being maltreated, not least because of what Germany did in World War I. So it's not that it's historically inaccurate so much, it's that if we operate on this basis, we would never stop having wars. And from an American perspective, for example, I find it strange that Americans could go along with this argument. Like half of America used to be Mexico. Calais used to be England. We can carry on down this path forever. And in fact, the two world wars in Europe, basically over Alsace-Lorraine, who owns this tiny bit of land between Germany and France. How long do you want to keep the shit going?
No, absolutely, absolutely. And it seems that the people agreeing with this point are people who fundamentally don't understand history and don't understand conflict and don't understand conflict over territory.
Or don't want to.
Yeah.
Because we've got to recognize, you and I on this show have been covering the fact that there's a section of the extreme left that has become fundamentally anti-Western and anti-American in particular.
Yeah.
And a chunk of those people are big fans of Putin and what he's doing for that reason. And so they will believe anything that he says. And there are also people on the extreme right. I don't mean the far right, but the people who are the anti-establishment right. There's a section of that group. It's hard to call them anti-American because they think they're patriots, but they are so anti the American elite that they see anyone who hates the American elite as much as they do as an ally without realizing what we'll, I'm sure, talk about later, what Putin wants for America, which is decline. And he talks about it quite openly later on. Let's
later. So we'll come to that later on in the interview. Now, Putin was actually very interesting because this is the longest time this is the only time I've ever seen him interviewed. And he struck a very conciliatory note. So when he was talking about the post-Soviet NATO expansion, he was saying, look, all we wanted was to be part of your club. And at every turn we were rebuffed. What were we meant to do? Now, how much of that is accurate and how much of that is him spinning a yarn to make Russia look like the victim?
Well, the thing is, nobody really knows because he keeps alluding to these conversations that he had with Western leaders. And he says, this is what I said. And Tucker says, well, what did they say back? And he says, well, I can't reveal private conversations. You should talk to them. He talks about one instance in particular where he said to Bill Clinton, what would happen if Russia applied to join NATO, and Clinton sort of says, oh, that'd be interesting, and then apparently later, having spoken to his team, Clinton says, actually, we couldn't do that. And Tucker quite smartly says to him, well, would Russia have joined? And Putin gives this very coy answer like, well, we would have seen. So none of us knows whether his question was sincere or whether the answer was sincere or whether the conversation happened the way that he recalls it. But also, I think there's a truth to what Putin says, which is I don't think NATO would have welcomed Russia because Russia is too big a country to absorb with too strong a view of its own. Just the entire rationale of NATO would not have made sense in that sense. So perhaps that may well be Russia's experience post. But whether that justifies everything that's happened since is a different question.
Yeah, but it's a quite ingenious PR tactic to not come out as a strongman, which is everybody associates him with, but to come out and say, look, we just wanted to be part of the club.
But the thing is, this argument that the West was so hostile to Russia that he makes, and he says, the Cold War commentators just needed to continue their grift, basically, is what he's implying. So they kept banging, talking down Russia and saying it's a threat. Was that your experience of the last 20 years?
No.
Because it wasn't mine. London has been overrun by Russian money, quite a lot of it illegitimate money being laundered here. Likewise, America is had been infiltrated with Russian money. Russia was not seen really as a hostile force in this country, certainly in this country and in Europe. Not in Germany, not in other places. In fact, there was a lot of business being done. So this idea that the West has been attacking Russia or rejecting Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I don't think that's observably true.
Oh, okay. Now, there's some people like John Mearsheimer have made this point, who have said, Ukraine was meant to be neutral. It was meant to be a neutral nation. It was meant to be a buffer. in between Russia and the West. And then, and this is to quote Vladimir Putin, it became a satellite state.
Yeah, and he talks about 5 rounds of NATO expansion.
Yeah.
And actually, I have to say, on this issue, I think he has a pretty good point. Like, this is an irritant for Russia, for sure. And we've talked about this before, right? I think when we first ever talked about it, he said to me, well, would Putin have invaded if NATO hadn't been expanding? And the truth is, we don't know, right? Certainly a factor in all of this, and it is absolutely an irritant to Russia. But the difference is that I think Putin sees that as a deliberate ploy to corner and antagonize Russia, whereas I think NATO expansion is largely a product of some very crude and basic things, like every time NATO expands, that means the weaponry of that country that it's just expanded to is changed to NATO standard, which creates a lot of money for Western companies, or American companies to be specific, to come in, rearm the entire country. So the American defense contractors are very interested in NATO expansion. So it's not that people wanted to, oppress poor little Vladimir Putin. It was more various things. Now, it doesn't excuse NATO expansion because promises were made. But the other reason, of course, is all of the countries that have joined NATO were terrified of Russia's renewed aggression, which they've experienced over centuries. And so they wanted to join. So it's like they wanted to join, and there was a lot of business interest in having them join. And that's probably why that happened. But certainly it's an irritant to Russia, for sure.
Absolutely. And whilst your explanation of it sounds plausible, there is a certain amount, again, I'm not saying what Russia did was correct, but I'm saying NATO needs to take some responsibility, because you may do something which you don't think is an antagonistic gesture, but can be perceived at that. And that's partly your responsibility, isn't it?
Agree.
Especially if you go against previous agreements, because then Russia will look at it and go, well, how can we trust you? We signed the document, you've broken the document, therefore what's the point in having any agreement?
And by the way, one of I think the big cultural differences here is obviously Russia is not a democracy. And so Putin doesn't understand that he's dealing with societies where the leadership changes regularly, and that means the strategic priorities, decisions, policies change over time. And so he's like, well, in 1997 they promised me this. Well, not 97 in his case, 1999, 2000, 2003, they promised me this. And then 6 years later they did that, right? But he's not taking into account it was a different president by that point, from a different political party, for example, right? So I think that's one of the big miscommunications there, is he's sort of treating America and the West as one thing that speaks with one voice, like Russia has spoken with one voice since 1999, since when he took over. And that discontinuity of leadership has been an issue here too.
Absolutely. Let's just have a quick look at this clip, because we're going to discuss that now. Elliot, it's a 2014 clip.
So, in 2008, the doors of NATO were opened for Ukraine. In 2014, there was a coup. They started persecuting those who did not accept the coup, and it was indeed a coup. They created a threat to Crimea, which we had to take under our protection. They launched the war in Donbass in 2014 with the use of aircraft and artillery against civilians. This is when it all started. There is a video of aircraft attacking Donetsk from above. They launched a large-scale military operation, then another one. When they failed, they started to prepare the next one. All this against the background of military development of this territory and opening of NATO's doors. How could we not express concern over what was happening? From our side, this would have been a culpable negligence. That's what it would have been. It's just that...
Now, he uses the word coup, and that's a pretty strong word. And he also says, that this was backed by the CIA, etc., etc., etc. What do you make of that? Is that a fair representation of events?
So this is the point where I think the paranoia, partly caused by NATO expansion, is starting to play its part, because I can see why he would see it in this way. However, it really isn't what happened. So in the clip we played, we don't include the bit where he talked about the trade agreement, and this is the really important part. So he talked about the fact that basically Ukraine was about to sign a trade agreement with the EU. And then the president, Yanukovych, he was basically a pro-Russian, or you might say a Russian puppet, whichever way you look at it. He was pro-Russian. Essentially, Putin's argument is Yanukovych realized that if he did a free trade deal with the EU, that would mean Ukraine's free trade deal with Russia would no longer be in place. That would be economically not what Ukraine should do. And so Yanukovych went back on this deal, which is why those evil Westerners organized a coup. This is completely not what happened. What actually happened was Yanukovych promised to sign the trade agreement, and then he went back on it. Now, the reason for that may or may not be perfectly legitimate. It might have been pressure from Russia. It might have been that he thought it was not a good deal for Ukraine. None of us know, right? However, what happened is a few students in Kiev went out on the street to protest against this because they were pro-Western and they wanted Ukraine to move in a pro-Western direction, representing about half of Ukrainian society. But a small group of students, protests happened, right? They were brutally beaten by the police. And when pictures and videos of this event went basically viral in Ukraine, people then came out on the streets to protest against what they saw as a tyrannical government brutalizing its citizens. And that is when the street protests started in Ukraine, right? So the Maidan, what ended up being the Maidan revolution, was started because of that rejection of the deal, and then the police treatment of the protesters, right? And the police continually kept aggravating the situation to the point where eventually over 100 people were shot and killed by Yanukovych. We don't know exactly which forces it was in those street protests that continued for a long time. And yes, eventually that led to the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. That is what happened. So is that a CIA-backed coup? Now, I think it's probably true that the West saw this as an opportunity to help Ukraine move in a Western direction. And this is, by the way, true of all revolutions. I mean, if you look at the American Revolution, something of which many people who are very critical of this are very proud of, American Revolution was basically funded by the French.
Yeah.
To the point where the French Revolution happened because the French state was so bankrupt after funding the American Revolution that they didn't have any money and the whole country went tits up. Right?
Yeah.
So every revolution in history has always been supported by the enemies of the superpower that was in the... Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. The Venezuelan Revolution was exactly the same, funded by the British.
Every revolution is like this, right? So, but what I'm saying is the catalyst for this was not the CIA. The catalyst for this was the brutal treatment of the protesters, which then spiraled into street protests, which then got more brutal treatment, which eventually ended in this. Now, what's interesting is 2 occasions in this interview, continuing from here, Putin talks about, well, in 2014 this happened, and then there was a threat to Crimea. Never says what was the threat exactly. Crimea was Ukrainian territory. What was the threat to Crimea? Never explains this, right? And it's a pity that Tucker never challenged him, because I would really like to have heard this. Now, what he actually means, I suspect, don't know. I don't know what Putin means. I wish someone had asked him. But the Sevastopol naval base has been a massive issue for Russia-Ukraine relationships since 1991, because it's basically the port in the Black Sea from which Russia is able to project its power into the Mediterranean. And the debate about who it should belong to, who should be controlling it, whose soldiers should be and sailors should be stationed there, had been ongoing since 1991. Well, basically, Russia is paranoid about that becoming A, unavailable to Russia, and certainly B, falling into American hands. So I guess what he means is there was a threat that Ukraine would become pro-Western, and therefore we would lose access to Sevastopol, so we had to take Crimea. But he never elaborates that, which is very, very telling.
And also, as well, he alludes to the fact that the Ukrainian elections, they weren't honest. There was something fundamentally dodgy
well,
about.
He talks about the coup. I think that's what he means.
Yeah, the coup, but also he talked about Zelensky being elected and how that wasn't particularly fair either.
He talked about Yanukovych and Yushchenko taking over from him. So his argument basically is, I had my guys in Ukraine, and they were not getting re-elected through various means. It was all the CIA.
Yeah.
That's his argument.
Yeah, so he sounds like a Latino. Right, so we've got, and then moving on, he starts talking, and this is where he starts to get even more conspiratorial, which is the whole denazification thing. He uses that word, denazification, And he goes into the historical element of it. How accurate is a historical element?
His historical telling of what happened in history is accurate. So what he's saying is absolutely true. During World War II, there was a section of Ukraine, I mean, we can call them Ukrainian nationalists, and we probably should because that's accurate. They were actually not part of Russia or the Soviet Union at the time. They were mostly living in what was Polish territory, if you like, who were basically fascists.
Yeah.
You got to remember, they were not Nazis, they were fascists. There is a difference. People these days don't understand the difference. You got to remember, quite a lot of Europe was fascist at this time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Spain was fascist, Portugal was fascist, there was a significant fascist movement, obviously in Italy, significant fascist movement in Central Europe and Southern Europe. There's quite a lot of them about. I mean, my favorite historical factoid is the people who defended the Reichstag was a unit of the SS called SS Charlemagne, made up completely of French fascists, defending the Reichstag in the last days of the Nazi war effort. My point is, a lot of Europe was fascist at the time, and these people were nationalists in that they wanted independence actually originally from Poland.
Yeah.
And they saw Hitler's invasion as an opportunity to free themselves both from Poland and from the threat of Soviet occupation.
Okay.
And these people were horrible people. And Putin's absolutely right. They killed Russians, they killed the Poles, and they killed the Jews. And they hated all of those people. And Putin is also right that in the attempt to build a Ukrainian identity, a lot of mistakes were made, including promoting some of these people, mainly because, to a large extent, because of historical ignorance. They're sort of seen as the only people who fought for the independence of Ukraine, so their crimes are kind of ignored. That's not the same as saying Ukraine is now pro-Nazi or anything like that, because nobody in Ukraine is, no, sorry, not nobody. Every country has a small Nazi contingent. Russia, by the way, I mean, Dmitry Rogozin, I always make this point, who was deputy prime minister of Russia and headed Russia's equivalent of NASA until recently, if not still. He's on camera openly giving the Nazi salute and saying Russia for Russians and all this other stuff. So there's a Nazi problem in all of Eastern Europe. But my point is, Ukrainian society is not overrun by Nazis. And Tucker actually very effectively challenges him on this. And he says, look, whatever you say about these people, you know, you're talking about Ukrainian nationalism. How do you deal with that? And again, Putin doesn't address it. What I thought was more interesting in terms of this kind of worldview is Putin says, we didn't start the war in 2022. The war started in 2014 when they attacked Ukraine, attacked the eastern regions. We saw it in the clip that we just played. And this is just nonsense, factual nonsense. It's like saying, you know, in the early 90s, when I still lived in Russia, Chechnya tried to break away from Russia. So what did Russia do? Russia attempted to prevent that from happening by force. This is what countries tend to do when a region, basically a bunch of armed men say, this is no longer part of this country, right? It's quite a normal thing to do. And that's basically what happened in the eastern regions. When this revolution happened in 2014, there were some people in the eastern regions who basically started an armed uprising backed by Russia who wanted to break away from Ukraine. And Ukraine attempted to suppress this rebellion, which is quite common in history, really. So it's not that Ukraine started a war, it's that it attempted to do exactly what Vladimir Putin tried to do and eventually succeeded in doing in Chechnya, which is to prevent an armed rebellion and a breakaway republic from breaking away. And to say that then in 2022, he continued defending Russia by re-invading Ukraine after, you know, it's just complete nonsense. That's the bit where he's just not telling the truth.
So, and it's very interesting that, because it is complete nonsense, which makes me think, why do you think he's saying that? Why? Because...
Well, he's given it away at the beginning of the interview. This is what I'm saying. He sees this as Russian land. And when Russian people rise up to rejoin Russia, it's his duty as the patriarch of all Russia to protect his fellow countrymen. And he keeps saying this. These are our people. They speak our language. We've got to protect them.
Yeah. It's just very interesting because a lot of the time I'm listening to him and I go, well, I don't know the background of what he's saying, but it sounds plausible. There are other things that he's saying where I go, oh, I don't agree, but I can understand why you're saying that. And then there's other bits, like in that bit, where I go, well, this is just completely disingenuous. And I would have expected him to have been a lot more skillful when talking about that, instead of giving what was actually an outright lie.
Well, that is how he sees it. I genuinely think he believes it. I mean, I think that is how he sees it. And I think we talked about the paranoia of the CIA and all of this stuff may have some basis, by the way. You know, big, powerful countries try to influence each other. You know, they do all that. You know, is influencing how he sees everything. And so when a bunch of Russian opposition activists start something in Russia, he can't imagine that anybody would oppose his rule. And he sees that as a CIA asset. Like, you know, we've gone to Extinction Rebellion protests in this country, or anti-British protests, or pro-Palestine protests, but it never occurs to me that they're being funded by the CIA or Mossad or, you know, the KGB or whatever, right? But in his mind, any opposition to him or to his country's interests or whatever is funded by the CIA, and that is how he sees the world, not least because he used to be an intelligence secret service operative himself. And so to him, of course, everything is happening because the CIA is doing it, because he knows that's how he operates and how his country operates.
Yeah. So what it does, in a sense, is engender a quite paranoid way of looking at the world.
And he's been in power for 25 years, which, as we know, is not exactly conducive to a kind of open-minded and...
Yeah, and anybody who gives him bad news, I can't imagine he takes it particularly well or challenges a viewpoint.
Well, a lot of people have said, and I think there's some credibility to this, is one of the reasons that he actually did invade Ukraine in 2022 was that he thought it was going to be a walk in the park. If you look at what they had tried to do militarily, it didn't look like someone seriously who thought they were in a serious conflict. They went in with far too few troops. They were not well prepared, they took very heavy casualties, because I think what he was told is, you know, the Ukrainian people will rise up and welcome you because they're not Ukrainian, they're Russian. And he just told you that. There's no such thing as Ukrainian people. They don't have a national identity. They see themselves as Russia, and they welcome back. And in fact, the very end of the interview tells us an incredible story about how apparently these Russian soldiers encircled some Ukrainian soldiers and said, surrender, lay down your arms. And apparently those Ukrainian soldiers said, Russians don't surrender, and were all killed.
I'll give you very unusual examples.
Совсем приведу вам необычный пример.
There's a combat encounter on the battlefield. Here's a specific example. Ukrainian soldiers got encircled. This is an example from real life. Our soldiers were shouting to them, "There is no chance, surrender yourselves, come out and you will be alive." Suddenly, the Ukrainian soldiers were screaming from there in Russian, perfect Russian, saying, "Russians, do not surrender," and all of them perished. They still identified themselves as Russian. What is happening is, to a certain extent, an element of a civil war. Everyone in the West thinks that the Russian people have been split by hostilities forever. No, they will be reunited. The unity is still there.
So in his mind, there are no Ukrainians.
Yeah.
There are like brainwashed Nazis, and then there's the majority of them who are Russians who are just desperate to rejoin the motherland. That's how he sees it.
Which is very interesting, that he could have got, somebody so powerful could have got it so wrong. But then if you obliterate anybody who disagrees with you, you're going to get an echo chamber.
And we've got an interview coming out with historian and I think, you know, well-informed guy called Mark Galeotti, who makes this very point.
Absolutely. Now, he is at pains to say continually that he wanted peace talks. He wanted peace talks. He even blamed Boris Johnson for scuppering them. It's very interesting because, again, presenting himself not as a strong man, but as this conciliatory figure who's been put in this position where he has no choice but to behave in this manner.
Well, I agree mostly what you're saying. I would just maybe quibble a little bit with your analysis. I don't think he's presenting himself not as a strong man. I think what he's presenting himself as a strong man who's reasonable.
Yes.
Right? So he's like, we invaded and we got some progress and then we were willing to negotiate. And then Boris Johnson scuppered the deal. Now, particularly in these kind of anti-establishment left and right circles, this is a very popular conversation. Boris Johnson prevented peace. Naftali Bennett, the Israeli prime minister, had a deal ready. It's actually, Ellie, are you able to pull up the article that I sent you? Naftali Bennett, the prime minister of Israel, who's basically, who's allegedly was, the deal was ready and it was all good, basically came out and said this is not true. The deal was really scuppered by the fact that when Russian soldiers pulled out of the area they occupied near Kiev, a lot of Russian atrocities, including Bucha, were found. And from that point on, there was just, the Ukrainian society was not going to do a deal.
Yeah.
And that's basically what happened. In terms of Boris Johnson, none of us know the details of that deal because it hasn't been revealed. But my understanding is basically they wanted significant territorial concessions and all kinds of other concessions. And Boris Johnson was saying, no, we'll help you fight and win back your land. Has that proven to be the right decision in the long run? Probably not at this point, because Ukraine, given the dwindling support in the West for continuing to support Ukraine at the level it would have needed to actually be able to do that, it hasn't turned out to be a good decision, I think. But at the time, you don't know what the future is going to be. So I think Johnson's argument was, we're on your side, we'll help you win the war, or win back your land, or wherever it is. Which is not an unreasonable thing to say to somebody who's about to basically surrender.
Yeah. And he also addresses this idea that Russia was going to take Ukraine and it was going to continue expanding.
Yeah.
And he said, look, I'm not going to do that. Why would I do that when actually that is going to bring us to the brink of global war?
Yeah.
I'm not crazy.
I'll remind you that in 2014, he said Russian soldiers are not in Crimea, and then gave out medals to Russian soldiers who were in Crimea for taking Crimea, right? Not everything Vladimir Putin says is always true, right? Now, you also got to remember, right? We've talked about this in the past, and I've said he absolutely has territorial ambitions beyond Ukraine. And he does, in my opinion. I'll explain to you why. However, does that mean that now, after what happened in Ukraine, he's going to invade Poland? No, right? Because one of the things that we've noticed is he's clearly didn't expect the result that he got in Ukraine, even though I would argue that he's winning, right? But the cost is very high to him and to Russia, etc. But if you play the argument that he's making right at the beginning of the interview for 30 minutes, there's a reason he spends that much time. He said he was going to take 30 seconds. It takes 30 minutes. His argument is, these are our lands populated by Russian speakers. Is Ukraine the only country populated with some Russian speakers? What about Latvia? What about Lithuania? What about Estonia? There's Russian minorities there. And by the way, if you want to make the argument that they're oppressed, absolutely. The Russian language is not permitted as the second state language. There are all sorts of things going on. So there's plenty that he could do if he found what happened in Ukraine easy. If Ukraine crumbled in 3 days, there's no reason why he wouldn't, look, NATO is obviously a strong disincentive, but my point is, to say now that he's going to be rushing into Poland is crazy. He's not. Even though I think he's going to get a form of win in Ukraine and therefore be disincentivized, he has an expansionist view of Russia because what he's trying to do is recapitulate the Russian Empire. Right,
and because he was his argument was that he didn't want to endanger the world, when that's something that I don't think you particularly care about when you invade another country illegally, because that is already a destabilizing event. Right.
And so if he saw Russian speakers be oppressed in Latvia, would he start a conversation about that? Would he see if NATO had entirely did nothing about Ukraine, would he see, well, maybe NATO is not going to do anything with it? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think the challenge to his invasion of Ukraine was very important, not least because it has deterred further aggression.
Yeah. And he was speaking about the multipolar world and the world that we are now moving into. And at one point, it sounded like a trigonometry guest And it was very interesting to hear him analyze it in this way. But he was talking about the multipolar world, and he compared the US to the Roman Empire in this clip. And it's a very interesting clip, actually. Elliot, if you can play it, and we'll dissect it afterwards.
I don't think so.
развивается вот по своим внутренним
My opinion is that the development of the world community is in accordance with the inherent laws, and those laws are what they are.
Так было всегда в истории человечества.
It's always been this way in the history of mankind.
Развивались,
Some nations and countries rose, became stronger and more numerous, and then left the international stage, losing the status they had accustomed to.
наверное, не нужно приводить эти примеры, но начиная
There's probably no need for me to give examples, but we could start with the Genghis Khan and horde conquerors, the Golden Horde, and then end with the Roman Empire.
человечество каждый
It seems that there has never been anything like the Roman Empire in the history of mankind.
потенциал варваров постепенно накапливался.
Nevertheless, the potential of the barbarians gradually grew, as did their population. In general, the barbarians were getting stronger and begun to develop economically, as we would say today.
Экономически они стали укрепляться.
This eventually led to the collapse of the Roman Empire and the regime imposed by the Romans.
500 лет. Этот процесс
However, it took 5 centuries for the Roman Empire to fall apart.
в сегодняшней ситуации
The
разница
difference with what is happening now
процессы изменений
is that all the processes of change are happening at a much faster pace than in Roman times.
So when
And it
does
was
the-
very interesting because he said those words and he had a, dare I say, a smug little smile on his face when he said it.
Well, this is the one thing that a lot of these... Look, I don't like antagonizing people, but it does irritate me when people don't understand what's going on because they don't listen and they only listen to the things they want to hear.
Yeah.
Right? For example, the Naftali Bennett thing that I brought up, like, you can Google it in 3 seconds that Naftali Bennett has basically denounced the things that are being said about what he said, but nobody does.
Yeah.
Right? And the same with Putin's speeches. He's been saying since day one, American dominance is over, the time for the multipolar world is coming. And but what he means by it is what he's just explained to you. And I wish people would just get it. What he's saying is very simple. There are natural laws of history, which is population and economy is destiny. China, India, Russia, BRICS as a whole, we are the new force on the block. America, Europe, and the West is in decline. And either you accept this and go gently, quietly into the night, or it's going to be a painful process like the one you're experiencing now, right? He's saying, your time is up. You're not going to be the world leaders anymore. It's over. That is literally what he's saying over and over and over. And people are like, you're a warmonger. I'm like, that's what he's saying. And he just told you again. Watch the interview. He says this over and over. And every time the idea of the multipolar world comes up, that is exactly what he's saying. He's saying the American elites are clinging on to the power of the American dominance. They're using the American dollar. They're using this. They're using that to try and dominate the world. Your time is up. It's over, right? And he keeps referring to this conspiracy theory that is very popular in Russia and also in parts of the third world, which is the golden billion idea.
Yeah. And so he mentioned the golden billion, and I mean, it sounds like a rapper. What is the golden billion?
That is a great name
for a rapper, yeah. It's a brilliant name.
Look, the golden billion is an idea that's been popular in Russia since, like, even in my childhood, even Cold War times. And it's basically the idea that what the Americans really want, the Americans and the West in particular, is for there to be an elite group of people, the top billion people in the world, who are rich and comfortable, and for everybody else to be essentially enslaved to them, for them to profit off and to live in poverty for the rest of eternity. Right? So the golden billion, they're going to be rich and prosperous and comfortable, and everybody else is going to live in mud shacks. And that's what apparently the Americans want. And this is universal, and he believes it, and he keeps repeating it, and so do lots of people, which is interesting given the evidence, not only the evidence, but what he himself is saying about how actually China, India, you know, Latin American countries are doing, Brazil obviously, are doing incredibly well, Indonesia. The world's population has been lifted out of poverty at a scale that is completely unprecedented in the recent decades for one reason, and one reason in particular, which is the spread of free market capitalism around the world. That's why people are getting wealthier in those parts of the world. So the idea that Westerners want to oppress everybody else at their expense so that we can be rich is just factually and obviously and observably incorrect. But when we talk about a paranoid conspiratorial worldview, if you think about it, there's nothing more paranoid and conspiratorial than believing that other people want to keep you poor.
Yeah.
Even though you can see that the main thing, look, I'm not saying America doesn't want to be the richest country in the world, and I'm not saying American corporations don't want to exploit the wealth and the resources of other countries, but other countries also want to exploit the wealth and resources of America and of other countries too. This is the global economic game, right? But what has happened with global trade, it has been disruptive for all societies, but it has also been massively beneficial to those societies around the world, which is why everybody is so much richer, so much wealthier, and so much more comfortable. So this is just like a complete conspiracy that he and a lot of people in that part of the world believe.
And you know what's really interesting as well is there was a disingenuousness about it when he was talking about their alliance with China, when from the people that we've spoken to, including Mark Galeotti, saying the Chinese, they're not that friendly with the Russians.
Look, the Chinese, they're very sensible and they have a very long view of history. But I can tell you, Russia is absolutely terrified of China. Absolutely terrified. Most of the far east of Russia is increasingly being effectively taken over by Chinese people who are moving in en masse, taking over local businesses, whatever. And as Putin himself acknowledges, China's a huge country, very, very powerful. And he says, we've been living peacefully together with a massive border for... peacefully is a very dubious statement given some of the things that happened around World War II and prior to that. So, it's a complete misnomer. It's not an easy alliance. Putin has been pushed into it by events, but he would much rather be in alliance with the West.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. I think he'd much rather be in an alliance with the West than China. And let's talk just a little bit about sanctions. The sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. Yeah. What effect is that having on the life of the average Russian and the Russian economy?
Well, he made this point actually that despite the sanctions, Russia was the biggest economy in Europe last year.
Yeah.
And it speaks to something, I've always been extremely skeptical about the way sanctions have been applied. I mean, the idea that you were going to, degrade Russia's economy with Western sanctions was never true. What we should have been doing is very specifically targeting the supplies of military equipment, which, by the way, there would have been way more support for around the world. People in India, really, the people who run India, and probably most of the population in India, people in Africa, people in China, they don't really care that much about the war in Ukraine. They were never on board with, slowing down the global economy to punish Russia. They didn't see that way at all. But they might have been on board with sanctions, to prevent missile systems being developed or being built or being, cruise missiles being produced. And the West and Western technology was used in a lot of Russian military equipment. So rather than focusing on the economic sanctions, which have hurt everyone, but really haven't disproportionately hurt Russia, which is kind of what you'd want to do if you were applying sanctions in a smart way, just was not a good idea. And, the West went overboard in a lot of stuff, like banning Russian performers from ballet and stuff. It's just, what are you doing?
No, absolutely. I mean, there was ridiculous, instances where people banned dead Russian composers.
Yeah, I was picking up someone up at the airport like 3 months ago, and a guy came up to me who just recognized me and was like, look, can you help me out? I'm Russian, I have a Russian passport, and they won't let me exchange money. I'm like, how does a normal person from Russia not being able to change money in an airport in England stop Putin's invasion of Ukraine? So there was a lot of this moral virtue signaling, which the West is now infected with, that got concocted into strategy, and suddenly we were doing all this stupid stuff just so that we could feel good about ourselves instead of being more strategic and practical.
Do you think, on reflection, the 2 hours, 20 minutes, what do you think that Putin hoped to get out of it? And number two, how do you think he came across?
Well, this is something interesting because on your second point, how he came across, I think to most people in the West, he actually came across incredibly well, not least because of the contrast with our leaders.
Yeah.
And part of that, to put it gently, is that some of our leaders are not up to scratch. Some of them have dementia, not mentioning any names. Some of them are just not very capable. But also, you have to recognize another thing, which is something that, you know, as you and I, we do the show, our profile increasingly grows. We meet politicians from different parties and we talk to them, you know, in the backgrounds of TV shows and all that sort of thing, and elsewhere. Actually, some politicians in the West are actually quite impressive people who could also hold court about the history of the UK or the history of America for half an hour if they had the opportunity to be interviewed in the style that Vladimir Putin was interviewed about, and if they had the opportunity to be in power for 25 years, right? It's not, Vladimir Putin didn't give interviews like this in 2001. He was not educated about Russian history. He couldn't talk about it in any authoritative way. Well, a lot of Western politicians could, but they're not facing the same media regime. They're constantly interrupted, they're challenged, they're misrepresented endlessly. I mean, look at, you know, an obvious example. How much was Donald Trump lied about, misrepresented endlessly by his own journalists? Vladimir Putin doesn't have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Never has. He got rid of the independent media very quickly. And, you know, whatever you think about the Tucker Carlson interview, it was actually quite in the style of a Triggernometry interview where you let people talk and you push back every now and again. It was not a confrontational, hostile interview. So he comes across very well. And by the way, people will say I don't like Putin, and I don't. But it's not because I don't think he's intelligent or capable or smart strategically. He is all those things, right? So he comes across well. People are not used to hearing from him. They've been painted a picture that he's he's that guy off Austin Powers.
Dr. Evil.
Dr. Evil. Good name for that character.
Yeah.
You know, he's sitting there stroking some weird cat.
Yeah.
And he's not. He's the leader of a country who has a strategic vision for his country. I don't agree with a lot of what he says, or certainly with a lot of what he's done, but that caricature is what he's up against, and it's very easy to look good against that when you're given 2 hours to kind of lay out your argument, right? So I think he's come across well. What was your first question?
Why do you think he's done that? Why do you think he's agreed to this interview?
But this is one of the things that I didn't like about what Tucker did, is Tucker tried to pretend that he's the only journalist that's basically tried to get an interview with Putin. He said, I'm the only journalist that's bothered to interview. And Putin's spokesman came out and said, this isn't true. We've been approached by Western journalists all the time. And so have a lot of Western journalists. Now, those people haven't got those interviews. And I think that tells you a story. First of all, he knows who Tucker's audience are. Tucker's been cultivating this audience for a long time. I can tell you, as someone who's been on the show many times, or a couple of times rather, sorry. I can tell you, as someone who's been on the show a couple of times, that when I suggested to his producer that we should talk about this issue on which I disagree with Tucker, they refused to do it. And when it came to talking about the stuff that I normally talk about, which is, woke culture, which we're equally concerned about and whatever, very happy to hear my thoughts. When he came to this, very hostile immediately.
Really?
And really didn't want to hear it. So it wasn't like, we disagree, let's have a conversation. It was like, no, we're not talking about this. So he knows who Tucker's audience are. Tucker's audience are that section of the left and that section of the right that we've talked about before, who, for their own reasons, are either anti-American in principle, like former guest on the show, Aaron Maté, who said America's the
Death Star.
The Death Star,
yeah.
Right? Or the sections of the right who are so anti the establishment that they will side with anyone who's anti their establishment, including enemies of America like Vladimir Putin. So he knew he was talking to a friendly audience who would lap it up. And if you open your Twitter and look at all the right-leaning and left-leaning accounts from those sections, they all lapped it up and they all spread it to their massive audience.
So do you think Putin saw it as basically a very powerful PR exercise?
Of course. What else is in it for him? You think he liked... It's not like he's a podcast guest. He's not on the podcast circuit, is it?
Maybe he should be, mate.
You get a lot of views,
Yeah.
clearly. Yeah. But, he's got a country to run, so he's not running around doing podcasts.
Yeah.
To him, this was an opportunity to speak to the people in the West who already agree with him, and he spoke to them.